Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I want to go back to our friends at History Dose today. If you're not familiar with their channel, they've got a little over 700,000 subscribers, so why not? But if you're not familiar with their channel, they have a very unique presentation style, which I think is absolutely awesome. They do their own art, and I think it's just one of the best presentation styles on this platform. And they tell stories that a lot of other people don't focus on. We all have those kind of pet areas of history that we love to talk about. They focus on some of the lesser known stuff, and I think that's great. I think that's important. So today we're going to take a look at one of those lesser talked about events in American history, which is the War on the Nez Perce in 1877. So, as always, a link will be down in the description to the original content. Check them out if you like the way this video is set up. That is their style, and I think it's great, and it works really well. We've done a few other of theirs over time. They're great guys. I've had a chance to talk to them here and there, and very proud to recommend their channel to you. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Real quick, it bothers me to learn that countless people's private info is being sold and shared by online data brokers. Not to worry, today's sponsor, Delete Me, makes it quick, easy, and safe to remove your personal data online, but more on that later. Blue lilies ran in drifts along the edge of the teepees, where children played and elders talked. The days of traditional gatherings on this stretch of prairie were coming to an end. These bands of Namipu or Nez Perce people were making the last ride into exile. A treaty in 1855 had established the legal right of the Nez Perce to nearly all of their ancestral territory, but in 1860 Euro-Americans discovered gold in the region. Piece by piece, thousands of prospectors and miners plotted and carved the earth. Their coughing boomtowns anticipated a ceaseless migration of settlers, who staked homes, farms, and ranches in violation of the treaty.
And this is kind of the story of Manifest Destiny. So if you're not an American, you're not real familiar with American history, all the way back to before the American Revolution, there's this idea that is born within people who settle this country of manifest destiny, that they have a destiny, almost like a God-ordained role to spread all the way to the Pacific Ocean, that someday all of that territory that we now know as the United States would belong to these people. And that's one of the driving forces behind the revolution that doesn't get talked about, is the desire to spread west of the Appalachian Mountains, which was treaty bound, that British settlers weren't allowed to go to. So once they go past that, then you're hitting the Mississippi River. Now you're thinking about what's past there, and you have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which then opens up a bunch of more territory, and then it's just, Gold Rush, 1849, the 49ers who go out to California. California becomes a state, and the whole West Coast gets settled, but everything in between is still kind of set aside mostly for the Native Americans. But these treaties get made, sometimes with people who aren't even in a position to make the treaties, others with people who can't enforce the treaties, and over and over and over again, gold gets found, or some precious, silver gets found, or just for some reason, there's something that happens and a conflict breaks out, and you have the Mormons who go west and settle Utah, and all of these reasons why European settlers, people of European descent, just keep taking territory that they have given over. And you have to ask yourself the question, if you are one of these indigenous peoples, how many times do you allow that before you won't take it anymore and you finally fight back?
Steadfast allies of the United States, the Nez Perce were loath to retaliate and pleaded for diplomatic resolution. Careful to retain the gold mines and settlements, government representatives drew new borders in 1863 and convinced certain conciliatory Nez Perce leaders to sign a treaty forfeiting some 90% of their people's land.
And notice how he said certain conciliatory leaders. This is what happens sometimes, is that you get some of the leaders of some of these groups of people, or you get people who aren't even really in a position of authority within that group of people, but they're willing to sign. And the government says, well, hey, you signed a treaty. even though other groups of people and other leaders and chiefs say, I didn't sign the treaty, or why should I believe the treaty? You've violated every other treaty we've had. Look how it's shrinking. Look how eventually there's nowhere else to go.
The wise Chief Joseph of the Wallowa Valley likened this to learning that your neighbor has sold away your horses without your permission. For the Nez Perce were composed of semi-autonomous bands, none of which possessed the authority to speak for all the others.
Yep.
Commissioners from the U.S. government conceded as much in 1873. If any respect is to be paid to the laws and customs of the Indians, then the Treaty of 1863 is not binding upon Joseph and his band. No such respect was paid. While most Nez Perce lived on the reservation, the outlying bands led by Joseph, Tehulhulzut, Looking Glass, and Whitebird remained peacefully on their homelands. It was only now in 1877 that the military threat from General Oliver Otis Howard compelled them to make for the reservation.
So let's talk about Oliver Howard for a second. He's well known from the American Civil War. He's a Medal of Honor recipient for the battles in 1862 outside of Richmond, where he loses an arm. Very famously takes over the 11th Corps, which is largely made up of immigrants, German immigrants, in 1863. And they have back-to-back debacles at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. But Howard, by and large, performs pretty well as a soldier and is eventually given an army command in 1864 in the Western Theater under Sherman, and performs pretty admirably there. After the war, he's put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is the group that is set up by the government to try and help newly freed men, women, and children who have been enslaved. And he's also the namesake of Howard University, which he helped to get started.
Not everyone could stomach surrender. At night, a few young Nez Perce men recalled the depredations their people had suffered in years past. Trespassing settlers had stolen their cattle and horses, killed their men, assaulted their women, crimes largely overlooked by the American justice system. The three furious Nez Perce rode out to avenge the death of a relative. They struck homes and killed several men, then rallied 16 more Nez Perce warriors the next night. The raiders brutally attacked men, women, and children, killing around 15 settlers in all.
And this is the problem, is that when all of this happens and some people are conciliatory and they're trying to work with the government and they're trying to come up with a peaceful solution, all it takes is one or two guys who rile up a few people and go kill some settlers, and pretty soon you're at war. A war you didn't want, you didn't ask for, but that's all it takes.
Joseph, away from the camp during the raids, would admonish them and reflect. Our young men were quick-tempered, and I've had great trouble in keeping them from doing rash things. I know that my young men did a great wrong. Yet the actions of a few had produced a casus belli against the whole.
Right. And the government's already violating these treaties anyway. They're going to look for absolutely anything to justify going to war. And this is also, remember, 1876 is when Custer is wiped out. The Little Bighorn with elements of his command, and you have what's called the Great Sioux War that happens a little further to the east of here.
General Howard sent over 100 men toward a canyon where most of the Nez Perce had moved camp. As some Nez Perce approached under a white flag, one of the U.S. volunteers shot at them. American soldiers dismounted and advanced toward the camp. The grassy hills then roiled with war cries.
This is what you're dealing with. It's tensions are on edge, and they've just killed settlers. They're approaching under white peace, and you've got jumpy soldiers, and one of them now fires. And so now you've had on both sides, you've had people who have kind of taken things into their own hands and have ramped up the tensions even further. And this is how a situation like this can quickly spiral out of control.
Some 60 Nez Perce sharpshooters emerged and hit kill shots, strategically targeting trumpeters and officers to break American cohesion. In the long retreat, the winding knolls were matted with dead soldiers. The Americans lost over 30 men without killing a single Nez Perce. The latter were capable warriors. They possessed well-bred Appaloosa horses, organized maneuvers with signals, emboldened themselves with taunts and songs, and lacking reliable access to ammunition, their gunners had learned to be extremely accurate. Howard, fearing that others would join Joseph and the defiant bands, ordered the arrest of the neutral chief Looking Glass and his people. Villagers fled as U.S. cavalry attacked, plundered their homes, and stole 600 horses. Neutrality shattered. In early July, Looking Glass and his band joined Joseph and the others, who had skirmished with troops and raided abandoned farms since their victory at the canyon. Joined by some Palouse allies, the combined party numbered roughly 800 people, around 250 of whom were men of fighting age. The caravan held off an attack by Howard, then vanished into the precarious Bitterroot Range of the Rockies. Arranging safe passage with local troops, the miles-long column cut through mountains and into the Bitterroot Valley. The people, their food, teepees, and weapons borne by 2,000 horses. Some Nez Perce had periodically trekked across these mountains for the bison hunt and built alliances with indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. Looking Glass now assured his fellow chiefs that they could journey east and find assistance among the Crow, with whom some Nez Perce had once fought side by side against the Sioux.
So a couple of things here in talking about that. Number one, by this point, you're starting to have the bison be nearly wiped out by westward expansion, not only for their furs and other parts, but also just to deny that to these native tribes who very heavily rely on that for their way of life. But also the Crow are, and again, anytime we're talking about these groups of people, understand that not only should we never just lump all of these indigenous or Native American tribes into one, because they're so different and so diverse, just as different and diverse as different people groups are in Europe or Africa or anywhere else. But also, even within those groups like Crow or Nez Perce, there are some who are going to feel differently, like we've seen. Some Nez Perce working with the Americans, others not. But the Crow are known to be a tribe who has sided with the American government. Their scouts have worked with people like Custer and have been, because they kind of sided with the Americans, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Lewis and Clark emerged from this same route 7 decades ago. The Nez Perce had fed the starving Americans, and on the way home the expedition stayed with them for over a month, during which time the peoples pledged friendship. Early French-Canadian traders referred to numerous local peoples as Pierce-to-Nose or Nez Perce, a term later anglicized and specifically applied to the Namipu, who incidentally had largely abandoned nose piercing.
That's where the name comes from. I know that pince nez is that kind of glasses that sit on your nose that Theodore Roosevelt was famous for, so it makes sense that I guess I never made the connection between French and that name.
The Nez Perce continued to dwell among their rivers, mountains, and prairies, in teepees and larger lodges made of reed mats or bison hides. Salmon was fundamental to their diet, supplemented by hunted game and wild plants. Beyond plain buckskin clothes, the Nez Perce produced striking garments. Women wore basket hats, colorful dresses, and jewelry. Men possessed similar adornments and sacred war shirts. The people believed themselves guided by spiritual guardians called Wayakin. As many adopted Christianity, others pursued the Dreamer faith, whose prophets preached that divine deliverance was found in a return to indigenous ways. For it seemed to some that the hour of the apocalypse was near.
Yeah.
The forests and plains were purged of their creatures, villages annihilated by plague, and survivors cast out of their homelands.
Look at all those bison skulls. I mean, just obscene how quickly they were wiped out.
Hope yet remained among Joseph and his people. Their scouts knew Howard would be weeks behind their trail. They were unaware that the frontier forts of the United States had been summoned against them.
See, they're counting on knowing the territory. This is home ground for them. They can move fast. They're the ones running, so they're not the ones doing the hunting. So there's certain advantages you have in that. But what they don't have going for them are numbers, which the United States can bring increasingly more and more of.
The band set their teepees at the foot of a tall slope along the Big Hole River. That night, over 100 American forces crept close enough, they later told, to hear dogs barking and Nez Perce babies crying. Just before dawn on August 9th, the soldiers advanced, instructed to aim low into the teepees to kill people as they slept.
Think about that. You heard babies crying. and now the next day you're going to attack there. And you're obeying orders, and you're probably whipping these guys into a frenzy by saying, look what they did to these white settlers who were peaceful and not doing anything. So what's the difference? And, but you got a young 19, 20, 21-year-old cavalryman who has probably never been away from home until he joined the army. It's amazing how hardened they probably had to become in order to do this kind of stuff.
They raked fire at the fleeing Nez Perce. A boy hiding in the nearby stream with his mother recalled, one little girl held her arm up from the cold water. It was a big bullet hole. I could see through it. The Nez Perce warriors struck back, killed many attackers, and repulsed them to the woods. A lengthy sniping battle covered the retreat of the Nez Perce caravan. The Americans had managed to kill 60 to 90 Nez Perce, including many women and children. 6 attackers would receive medals of honor. The shaken Nez Perce
Curious to know what the medals of honor, what the citation reads for these. Okay, so specifically, we're talking about the Battle of the Big Hole is the one that he just referred to. Colonel John Gibbon is the commander. He was the first commanding officer of what became known as the Iron Brigade. Great Union soldier during the American Civil War. 31 killed, 38 wounded for U.S. forces, which is about a third of their force. And 70 to 90 killed, of whom perhaps 30 were warriors. So medals of honor for the Battle of the Big Hole. Lorenzo Brown, a private with the 7th U.S. Infantry, having been severely wounded in the right shoulder, continued to do his duty in a most courageous manner. Wilfred Clark, conspicuous gallantry, a special skill as a sharpshooter. William Edwards just says bravery in action. John McLennan, gallantry in action. And Patrick Rogan verified and reported the company while subjected to a galling fire from the enemy. So you have to understand something about the Medal of Honor in this time. This is the only medal that the U.S. gives out to the military for anything. And so it wasn't held to the same standard that it is today, where it's super rare. Medals of Honor were kind of given out like candy back then. If you captured a flag in the Civil War, you got the Medal of Honor. So if you did, like, for example, at the Battle of Vicksburg, there was this group of soldiers known as the Forlorn Hope, and their job was to go ahead of the army, of the attacking force, and put down ladders and bridges for people to go across to attack the fortifications at Vicksburg. Every single one of those men in the Forlorn Hope was given the Medal of Honor just for volunteering for that role. So the standard changed once you get into the 20th century, and now you have the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, the Distinguished Service Cross, a lot of other medals that are given for bravery without having to rise to the level of the Medal of Honor.
Questioned the military leadership of Looking-Glass, but it was he who, 10 days later, led an attack directly on Howard's camp, stealing over 100 mules and horses. Having failed again to capture his targets, Howard grew weary, and he was chided by Commanding General of the Army William T. Sherman for his lack of resolve. The Nez Perce trekked ahead into stranger parts, known to some in those days as the Land of the Burning Ground, the recently established Yellowstone National Park.
It was established when Grant was president. Grant was president from 1869 to the beginning of 1877, and that was the time then that was established. So when Grant becomes president, Sherman becomes the general-in-chief of the Army. Everybody else kind of moves up one spot in the pecking order. Phil Sheridan is kind of the next in line after Sherman.
The trees, birds, and all the creatures grew and lived in the lush ruins of an earthen tower 40 miles across, the caldera of a supervolcano not truly awoken in 600,000 years. One could still recall when herds of bison rumbled past the sparkling salvos of its geysers, and grizzlies and moose lumbered across the wooded hills, and wolf dens stirred at the approach of outsiders. The forest now stood quieter. Animals along the frontier had been variously trapped, shot, and poisoned. General Sherman wrote with satisfaction that the sudden depopulation of animals had starved Native Americans from their homelands on the nearby plains and cleared the land for settlement and industry. This vast region has undergone in the past 10 years a more violent and radical change than any like space of the Earth's surface during any previous 50 years. The game is nearly all gone. The Indian has been forced onto small reservations. I can bear personal testimony that where in 1868 millions of buffalo could be found, not a single one is now seen.
So think about, this is not just about taking land. This is about a complete destruction of a way of life. If your way of life is about the earth and the land in which you live and the game that you hunt and being able to move freely and the idea of specific boundaries and settlements that you live in is really kind of foreign to your culture. So coming in and wiping all of that out and forcing you to constantly move and to say, this is our land now, that is a shock to the system. And you can only imagine if a foreign group of people came into where we live and they were more powerful than us and more numerous than us and started completely changing how we lived and told us to live, to move somewhere else. How would we respond? Probably not any differently.
While the wildlife of Yellowstone would one day flourish again, for now the park was a place to hide. Over the next 2 weeks, the main caravan took tourist parties captive to cover their whereabouts before releasing them with food and directions. But small bands of Nez Perce warriors, furious over the massacre at Big Hole, broke off, robbed, and attacked several tourists, to the condemnation of Chief Joseph.
So again, you have a situation where different groups are handling this differently, but all of them are going to take the brunt of the blame for what some did.
Looking Glass meanwhile made contact with the Crow, who declined his request for help. They would not risk defying the United States. The last hope lay far north.
Canada.
Hounded by American forces after his triumph at Little Bighorn a year ago, Lakota Chief Sitting Bull and some of his followers had fled to Canada. Parts patrolled only by mounted police who lacked the power to extradite armed indigenous warriors. Whitebird had long advocated that the Nez Perce seek refuge with Sitting Bull, and the Council of Chiefs now agreed. The prospect of such an alliance had occurred to Howard, but General Philip Sheridan assured him that the idea was ridiculous. While Howard trailed the Nez Perce, additional forces under Colonel Sturgis angled to cut them off. Threading the jagged Clark's Fork Canyon, the Nez Perce then ascended the great rock walls, milled their horses in a circle to conceal their trail, and feinted south. Sturgis pursued the false trail, only to find that the Nez Perce had cut back north into the canyon and escaped onto the plains. Sturgis reached them on September 13th, and with the help of the Crow, managed to capture many horses, but the Nez Perce killed several of his men and escaped into the night. The long days of riding ahead were punctuated by fearful nights on the quiet expanse. Around Cow Island, the hungry Nez Perce skirmished with soldiers and plundered supplies from a steamboat landing and a wagon train.
So what you have here now is just these people are just trying to survive, and they're trying to get north of the border. But if you're the U.S. military, you're thinking, okay, we just fought against Sitting Bull, fought against the Lakota Sioux and all of their allied groups. They've now fled north. Now we're fighting against these people, and they're fleeing north. It's a logical conclusion for them to think they're going to ally with Sitting Bull, and now they're going to have this combined stronger force that's then going to raid back across the border, and now we're going to have to deal with twice the amount. So let's try and wipe these people out before they can get there. It doesn't matter to them that might not be the intentions of this group. It's what they think is happening.
Winds grew cold as they trekked north. The horses were hurting, the people still grieving. Looking Glass insisted they pitch their tattered tents in the foothills of the Bear Paw Mountains. Over 1,000 miles and 4 months behind them, the Nez Perce sat 40 miles from the border. But the capable Colonel Nelson A. Miles, who had routed bands of Lakota over the last year, had tracked them with a large force bolstered by Cheyenne scouts. On September 30th, Miles' men stormed the camp, fired on defenders, and captured most of the horses. Some Nez Perce managed to flee north, but most were pinned down as warriors traded kills with the enemy, who then established positions around the camp. Among the dead were Tehulhuzot and Joseph's brother Olacott. Snow fell that night. It shrouded the corpses of kinfolk while the living burrowed into holes and warriors kept guard in rifle pits. Artillery pounded the hills. Many hoped that those who fled north would return with Sitting Bull and the Lakota and scatter the Americans.
So see, there is that hope of coming back with Sitting Bull. You have to think that the more of your friends who die, the more of your wives and children who die, the more angry you become. And that's true on both sides because, these American settlers have been killed as well. Not passing judgment one way or other on the ethics of all of that. It's just the reality. The reality is both sides feel justified in killing the other, even men, women, and children who are not in the military. But this is just when you do bad things to other people, they do bad things back to you, and pretty soon nobody's good.
Looking Glass rose to scan the faint edges of the battlefield for rescuers, and an American soldier shot him in the head. The cold stalemate lasted for days. Howard arrived in Miles' camp late on October 4th. While each side had killed around 25 of the other, the Nez Perce people were ailing.
And they've had their leadership decapitated too, right? Several of their most important leaders in this group of Nez Perce have been killed.
The next day, flanked by 5 companions, Chief Joseph rode over the White Hills, his rifle across his lap. He met with Miles and Howard, and it was recorded that he surrendered with the words, "I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. Looking Glass is dead. Tehuhuzot is dead. The old men are all dead. He who leads the young men is dead. The little children are freezing to death. My people, some of them, have run away to the hills and have no blankets, no food. No one knows where they are. I want time to look for my children and see how many of them I can find. Maybe I shall find them among the dead. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever."
Fight no more forever. And that's the very famous line from that. I will fight no more forever. He just got to the place where I love my way of life. I love my people. I just don't want to lose any more of them. And that's a perfectly reasonable place to get to. You fought. You did the noble thing. Now it's time to survive.
Whitebird would escape north with some followers. In all, around 200 reached Sitting Bull's camp. Joseph and many others could have escaped if they had been willing to abandon the young, wounded, and elderly, but they were not. The 400 or so who surrendered at the Battle of Bear Paw did so with the understanding that they would move to the Nez Perce Reservation, the remaining sliver of their homeland. But Sherman overruled Miles and sent the prisoners to Indian Territory, a bleak spot of land among other removed peoples such as the Comanche and Osage. Days after the end of the war, the New York Times published the following. "We freely express the opinion that the Nez Perce War was, on the part of our government, an unpardonable and frightful blunder.
Wow, good for them.
A crime whose victims alike are the hundreds of our gallant officers and men, and the peaceful bands who were goaded by injustice and wrong to the warpath." The belief that the Nez Perce had been cheated of their homeland and unjustly hunted by the U.S. was not the tendentious making of later revisionists, but in fact a prevailing view among the American public during and after the war.
This is a time when, think about what the United States has been through in the previous couple of decades. This is still only 12 years after the end of the Civil War. 2% of the population died in that war. Major upheaval. The entire way of life in the South has been upended, rightfully so, but has been upended. There's racial horrors happening down there. People are being massacred in huge numbers. Lynchings and riots and all sorts of stuff is happening. Reconstruction has now ended. They've just come through a really contentious 1876 election that was probably decided by fraud. And it's just an ugly time to be an American. And in the middle of all of that, you have people acknowledging, hey, we're not right here in how we're treating these people. Did it affect long-term the outcome, though? I don't know.
Sherman conceded that the Nez Perce had fought humanely, and displayed a courage and skill that elicited universal praise. Chief Joseph became a national figure. He delivered speeches in the capital and tearfully pleaded for a return to his homeland.
Yeah.
The Nez Perce had lost up to 150 people during the war. Within just 3 years of exile, limited rations and lack of medicine contributed to 150 more deaths. They would lose almost every young child, including Joseph's daughter. Howard wrote to Joseph, "I have much compassion for you. I feel sorry that so many have sickened and died." And Miles, who insisted that indigenous people needed to be civilized, lamented, "We have carried on a cruel, relentless war of extermination against the Indian." Most who had escaped to Canada made their way back to the United States. And in 1885, the Nez Perce Indian Territory were permitted to return to the Northwest. Though fragmented and resigned to reservations, the Nez Perce would survive. Barred from even the Nez Perce Reservation, Chief Joseph was exiled to the Colville Reservation. The dream of regaining the land of his father remained a dream. He died on the Colville Reservation in 1904. It is often wondered at by the general public why we should have Indian wars, wrote General Sheridan a year after the Nez Perce surrendered. Sheridan, having overseen the removal of thousands of indigenous people across the American West, offered no sermon about westward destiny, but addressed the matter frankly. We took away their country and their means of support, broke up their mode of living, their habits of life, introduced disease and decay among them, and it was for this and against this they made war. Could
Understandably so.
Less?
At least they acknowledge that. Now listen, I'm not trying to suggest that the Native Americans were perfectly innocent people who wouldn't have just as easily done this to other groups. Many of them had fought wars of conquest and fought against other tribes and were perfectly capable of being, had the roles been reversed, of doing the same kinds of things. The entire history of humanity is filled with wars of conquest and taking territory from other groups of people. The United States is not the first and not the last to do it. Still sucks. Still really, really sucks that we did this. And it would suck just as much if somebody did it to us. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at part of history we don't talk nearly enough about. If you have a particular video that deals with this time and place in history you think I should check out, let me know in the comment section below. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.